Okay, buckle in, folks. We're on chapter 8, which is Deviance. And this is my area of expertise. I will try not to bombard you with all my knowledge. So, does everyone, regardless of their race, run the same risk of going to prison if they engage in illegal drug use? Guess what? They do not. So let's start with what is deviance. Deviance and crime are two different things, although crime is a category of deviance. So deviance is a recognized violation of any social norm. It's whenever we deviate from what kind of behavior is expected of us. Whereas crime is a category of deviance and it's a violation of a formally enacted law. Something cannot be a crime if there's not a law forbidding it or requiring it. And then the other piece that makes something a crime is it has to have some sort of punishment or consequences for that. Now, a common element of all deviant acts is that there's something different about the behavior, and that causes us to regard the person who's done that behavior as an outsider. Some people, just by their existence, are considered deviant. Now, all of us then in turn are subject to some form of social control. That's attempts by society to regulate our behavior. And those can be formal and informal. And most social control is informal. It's when someone gives you a dirty look or talks about you behind your back in an attempt to change your behavior. Formal social control would be like formal interventions by, the criminal justice system. How we define deviance, what we define as deviant, who we define as deviant, that's all a reflection of our culture, and that's all socially constructed. So we're going to go through the fastest lesson in criminology you'll ever get in your life. So we have a full course here on criminology. You can get your degree in criminology. You can take an advanced course in criminology. Most of the courses in the CJ program touch upon some type of theory. And criminology is basically the study of the making of laws, the breaking of laws, and society's reaction to law breaking. But most people think about it as theory that explains criminal behavior. So early biological perspectives really focus on solely biological causes with no interaction with the environment that they think lead to criminal behavior. So Cesare Lombroso says there's 3 types of criminals. He's highly influenced by Darwin and the theory of evolution. And his first is a born criminal. And those are actually called atavistic throwbacks. And what he's saying is that criminals are a lower form of life, closer evolutionarily to their ape-like ancestors. And essentially, if you have 5 of these atavistic, which just means ape-like stigmata, then you're a born criminal. Okay. And here's, that includes things like a big jaw, strong canine teeth. Your arm span is greater than your height. And he basically says as far as women go. So remember, a lot of early theorists in criminology, just like in sociology, aren't really concerned with women. These theories aren't written by women. They don't really take women into account. But our buddy Cesare here says that criminal women have a different moral sense. They're revengeful, jealous, inclined to vengeance, of a refined cruelty. Now here's a longer list of those stigmata. Okay, asymmetry of the face. I'm not going to read all of these to you. Ears of unusual size, nose twisted, upturned, or flattened, fleshy lips, swollen and protruding. Notice these 2, the nose and the lips, right? These are pretty racist in origin, right? The nose one is referring to noses that might be stereotypically considered Jewish, and the lips one is referring to lips that may be stereotypically considered African or African American. Abnormal dentition, meaning teeth, abundance of hair, supernumerary fingers and toes. Lombroso says there's two other types of criminals, insane criminals. These folks have changes in their brains which interfere with their ability to distinguish between right and wrong. That's essentially the definition of insanity today. And then because this does not account for all offenders, he throws in this third group that's basically like, here's everyone else. Criminaloids, an ambiguous group that includes habitual offenders, people who commit crimes of passion, and others. Now, our next school of thought also looks at biology, and it looks at body type. And this is the somatotype school. And this is put forth by Sheldon, I believe, and argues that our body build is related to our behavior. So we've got endomorphs. Okay, those guys look like Santa Claus, our first guy here, right? Soft body, underdeveloped muscles, a round shape, overdeveloped digestive system. Mesomorph is more athletic bodybuilder type, right? This is our guy in the middle, a hard muscular body, overly mature appearance, rectangular shaped, thick skin, upright posture. Then you have an ectomorph, which is kind of like Olive Oil. She's a cartoon character if you're not familiar with her, and she's very skinny. Thin, flat-chested, delicate build, young appearance, tall, lightly muscled, large brain. And Sheldon figures out and says, hey, guess what? Mesomorphs are more crime-prone. Now let's look at this and think about why a mesomorph might be more crime-prone. Well, that's a guy that physically is just going to be capable of more violence. Now, Gluick and Gluick did some research on this, and they found data that supports this. But the thing you should know is this is not data that's, or research that's well done. So there are some real effects here, right? But it's probably something else that's driving that, right? It's probably that if the way I'm looking at people is to take a sample of known offenders, well, the guys that are going to be more successful at violence are going to probably be guys who get caught and get reported and end up in prison. So these are non-representative samples. They don't account for cultural stereotypes. It's also very close to eugenics, which is the concern about all these early biological theories. That basically the idea then would be like, well, what do we do? Well, we would eliminate people who have these biological traits that are associated with offending. Now there's tons more biological theories. I mean, some of the really early ones are even things like, they would feel like the bumps on your head. That's called phrenology. There were some early theories that like people with red hair were more likely to break the law. Now today when we look at this, we look at how biology interacts with our environment, and there is science that backs that up and some of that up. But this idea that like, hey, if you're soft and doughy, you're probably not, criminally inclined, but if you're muscular, you are, just doesn't really hold water. Now, there's also theories that talk about like what kind of stuff about our personality drives crime. And so Freud is probably the most well-known personality theorist. He says that our well-being depends on a healthy interaction between all parts of our personality, and that our personality is made up of three parts: the id, ego, and superego. So the id is that I want part of you person. So it's the part of little kids that doesn't want to eat its broccoli, but wants to have a brownie at dinner. There's our superego. That's like our conscience, our values, and our reasoning. And then there's our ego, which is responsible for moderating between those impulsive drives we have and what our conscience tells us we should do. Now, Freud is super, super influential in psychology. If any of you are psychology majors or minors, I'm sure you've heard about Freud. And so he's still studied, and he's really the founder of psychoanalysis. But a lot of his stuff is not so nice. He really is a little misogynistic. Big fan of cocaine as well. Walter Reckless says that for every individual, there exists a containing external structure and a protective internal structure, and that this self-concept contains our behavior. And he basically says that good boys can handle frustration and follow all the cultural norms and values, and bad boys have a weaker conscience. They're easily frustrated and out of step with cultural norms. Now, here's the problem. if we look at people in terms of personality, there aren't really things about our personality that necessarily strongly and reliably predict criminal offending, because most people who break the law have normal psychological profiles. Now, classical theorists are sort of our very, very original theories of crime are like you're possessed by demons. And so they would like drill holes in your head to let the demons escape. And that's great. Yeah, maybe the demons escape, but guess what? You're also dead. So like, not really a great intervention. But our theories before that, before we get into these more science-based theories, are this classical school of thought. Okay. And it basically says deviance and crime is a free will choice. Okay. And all our behavior is shaped by society, and that includes deviant behavior as well. So what's considered deviant depends on the culture you live in. Okay. That could be your subculture, your neighborhood, right? So some things that we would consider deviant, other people wouldn't. That's just kind of the way things are, quote unquote. So no behavior is generally inherently deviant. It becomes deviant relative to particular norms. Okay. And those things change over time, guys. So when I was your age, very few people had tattoos. I kind of associated tattoos with like Vietnam vets and biker guys. And today I would bet like at least 60% of our class has tattoos. Guys, remind me, let's do a little quick survey in class and see how many of us have tattoos. As I mentioned in our chapter on sexuality, right, when I was in high school and college, people weren't really out. And today, I think people just sort of it's easier for people to comfortably just sort of casually say like, oh yeah, I identify as bisexual, I identify as gay, or I identify as asexual, right? However people identify. So deviance varies according to cultural norms. People become deviant as others define them that way. So people have to also define you as deviant, even if you're engaging in quote unquote deviant behavior, right? So we all violate cultural norms, but people have to sort of also be like, yeah, we don't like that. Those norms and the way people define them does involve social power, right? So who has the social power to define you as deviant, label you as deviant? Who has the social power to sort of reject those labels as being deviant? Okay, so we're going to talk about some more theories as we kind of get into our three SOCH paradigms we've been looking at. So that first one being functions, structural functional analysis, right? So Durkheim says there's nothing abnormal about deviance. Deviance serves a purpose, okay? First of all, what does it do? By labeling some things as deviant, right, it affirms our cultural norms and values. Responding to deviance clarifies those moral boundaries. It also brings people together, right? People do kind of love to come together to like, poop on someone else, right? It can also encourage social change, right? So how do we get to a point where more people have tattoos, right? So when I got my first tattoo, I was 24. My sister was 18. Me and my cousin took my sister for her 18th birthday. We got tattoos. We told like nobody, okay? We didn't tell our parents. We didn't tell people in our family because despite the fact that we were all legally adults and did not live at home, well, my sister still lived at home, but me and my cousin did not live at home. We knew it wouldn't be like welcomed. Okay. Fast forward, 20 years. After my Nana passes away, my mom gets a tattoo on her foot in memory of my Nana. And my mom is like super proud of it, even though like she really sort of, when she found out about each of our tattoos, wasn't me and my siblings, wasn't super psyched about it. And interestingly enough, says my Nana would love it, although my Nana was very anti-tattoo, like vocally anti-tattoo, right? So how do those things change? They change bit by bit. I got my second tattoo and I came home. It's on my foot. I just came home. It was there. My niece saw it. I didn't announce it to my mom, but my niece was little at the time and she said, Auntie got a little crazy on her trip, Nana. Look at the tattoo on her foot. Okay. So things kind of change gradually over time, and they change by people breaking those rules, breaking those boundaries. How do we get to a point where people are much more open about who they love and who their partners are in life? Is that people slowly did it. When gay marriage was legalized in Massachusetts, I think in like 2004, maybe. I'll have to fact check that date. Let's fact check it right now. Alexa, when did gay marriage become legal in Massachusetts? Okay, it's saying 2015, but that's for... I think that's federally. And now I gotta shut Alexa off because she's gonna be blabbing in the background. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. So my point was going to be, it gets overturned on a case in Massachusetts. It might be more like 2008. And initially, people in Massachusetts, despite being a very blue state, some people are kind of upset. And they say they're going to convene a Continental Congress to add an amendment to our Constitution that defines marriages between a man and a woman. Well, that's a 2-year process. People quickly kind of lost interest in it. It just didn't matter anymore. People kind of got over it, so to speak. So Kai Erikson does this study. It's a classic study of the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay. And it shows that the Puritans, a highly religious group, created deviance as a way of clarifying moral boundaries. Okay? So you might think you could make deviance go away, but Durkheim will tell you can't. Right? So even if we got everybody to stop murdering and raping and stealing, well, we just start to define other behaviors as deviant. Now, Merton talks about Merton really kind of talks about like modes of adaptations that we have culturally accepted goals. And here in the United States, that's the quote unquote American dream. Okay. And we have culturally acceptable means to achieve them. And that crime basically happens when people are still trying to achieve those goals, but do so through inappropriate ways. Okay. So conforming is the first mode of adaptation. And it means we accept the means and we accept the goals. I accept that I'm supposed to work hard, hustle, buy a house, get a vacation home, get 2 cars, have 2.5 kids, a dog, a white picket fence, whatever. Okay. And I'm going to work hard to get there. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to get a degree. I'm going to save my money. Now, innovation is, you accept those goals. You also want the car and the picket fence and the kids. Okay. But you might not have the same means to get it. Maybe college is outside of your reach. Okay. So you design your own means. Maybe you engage in robbery or embezzling or drug dealing. Ritualism is when you have given up those goals. You're like, these goals are not doable for me. I'm not going to reach them. But you still follow all the rules. So you expect limited success and you follow the rules because that's what you're supposed to do. Retreatism is we're giving up on the goals and the means, sort of dropping out of society, retreating into alcohol and alcoholism and addiction. And rebellion is where you create your own goals and your own means. It's like a counterculture. Like think about like the hippies. Now, Cloward and Olin talk about deviant subcultures, right? So Cloward and Olin talk about how crime comes from illegitimate opportunities that are available. And one thing to know about this is that illegal opportunities are also not equally available to people. You cannot just become a cocaine kingpin. There's certain skills that you need to have. You need to have access to cocaine. You need to have a network of willing customers, right? You can't just decide to become a cocaine kingpin. It doesn't work that way. Now, Cloward and Olin say that delinquent subcultures flourish in the lower class and take the forms they do because, as I mentioned, those illegitimate opportunities are also unequally distributed. If you've seen the movie Goodfellas, this is kind of a good example of that, right? It's really focusing on the mob, and it's loosely based on this guy, Henry Hill, who was in the mob and then went into witness protection and then came out and then ran his mouth a lot. And, that's another good example of like, can you just join the mob? Can I get on Craigslist and look for an opening or LinkedIn, an opening in the mob? No, it doesn't work that way. You got to have the right connections for that. So the form that subcultures or gangs take on depends on the neighborhood in which they develop. Now, Miller also talks about subculture, and he says that amongst the lower class, they just have different priorities, okay? And if you're ever trying to remember these, if you put them in a different order, the first letter of each of them spells latest, okay? So trouble, right? People in the lower class are often more focused on how much trouble they're in. Are they staying out of trouble? Are they getting into trouble? That's everything from fighting, drinking, sexual misbehavior. The more trouble you're involved in, the more prestige you have. So I've seen many young men who are in trouble with the legal system kind of really brag about what they've done and play up what they've done, make it sound more serious than it is, which really rolls into our next one, toughness. Shows of masculinity, denying any sentimentality, displays of physical strength. The concern with toughness comes from often growing up in single female-headed households, and so often feel more challenged about their masculinity. Now, smartness doesn't mean smartness like you guys are going to probably think about it. It doesn't mean like, are you in an honor society? What's your GPA? Are you on the dean's list? Can you outsmart, outwit, and con someone? It's really much more about street smarts. Excitement is about fighting, getting drunk, using drugs, risk, dangers, and thrills. Luck is the idea that there's not a lot you can do to drive your own life. Fate really kind of determines what happens to you. And then autonomy is the idea that you are independent and no one's going to push you around. Now, what are the criticisms of this perspective? Well, communities don't always come together in reaction to fear of crime. Sometimes people withdraw, right? Like sometimes people get very scared in their neighborhood and people just stay inside. As far as Merton's modes of adaptation, right? We could talk about the American dream, but maybe that's not everybody's goals, right? Like not everybody is really driven to have the house and a vacation home and 2 cars and 2.5 kids, right? Also, that doesn't necessarily really take into account, like, are women striving for the same goals? So these theories assume everyone uses the same standards for judging right and wrong behavior. They also really focus on defining deviance as things that poor people do, right? It also implies that everyone who breaks the rules is labeled as deviant, and we know that's just not true. Okay, so labeling deviance, symbolic interaction analysis. Okay, labeling theory comes about in the 60s. If you guys go on to grad school and you study criminal justice and you have profs that are older than me, generation above me, they love labeling theory. And basically labeling theory says that how we get labeled, and once we get labeled as a deviant or an offender, that we can internalize that label and that might lead to further deviance. So basically being labeled as a deviant produces more deviance. Okay. Now primary deviance refers to those initial deviant acts before you get a reaction from society. Okay. Once society's like, yo, we don't like your nonsense, and they label you as bad, then the deviance that results from that is called secondary deviance. So basically, this secondary deviance often leads to a deviant career, which leads to a stigma, which is often a master status, right? Like, think about it. We call people like ex-cons, we call people felons, right? How hard is it for someone once they've served time, once we know they have a record? I'm literally just doing some research this morning where I'm quoting articles about how sexual assault is described in the Herald. And the Herald has a series of articles over the 2023 year about ICE coming in and arresting people who are here in the country and are not supposed to be here in the country. And not only are the articles like very much focused on describing them as illegal immigrants or aliens. And granted, by the way, ICE is picking them up because they're, they've committed crimes. And all of my articles deal with sexual assault. So these are people who've committed serious crimes. I'm not saying let's let the rapist stay. Hell no, you got to go, right? Like, let's get out of here. But think about how once someone is like, if you know someone's here in the country and they're not a documented worker, right? They don't have the proper documentation. What's the stigma for that? What's the stigma once you've been labeled a rapist, right? And by the way, sometimes stigma is deserved. I don't feel any sympathy if you've been labeled a rapist, right? But here's an example. In Massachusetts, the age of consent is 16. If you're 16 and you have sex with someone who's 15 and 11 months old, you will be convicted for that offense, okay? Doesn't matter if it's consensual. The law says that person cannot consent. We refer to that colloquially as statutory rape because it doesn't require intent. However, the charge for that in Massachusetts is rape and abuse of a child. So if someone's on your criminal record, it would say rape and abuse of a child. That sounds very different, right? And so how might that sort of label affect you? Once people are labeled, we often then start retrospectively labeling their behavior. We start looking at past behavior and we're like, oh, well, that's obviously because of X, Y, Z. We might also start predicting future behavior. And the more the people in your social world buy into that description of you, the more likely it is that you'll buy into it, and the more likely it is that then it will become like a self-fulfilling prophecy. We also have a tendency to treat behavior that irritates us or threatens us, as opposed to treating it as like, that's just different. People just do things differently, but as deviant, right? So think about things like mental illness, right? We have all kind of gotten to a point where, well, first of all, there's more understanding of mental illness, but it also means then if somebody's kind of anal, they might be like, I'm a little OCD, right? Which really kind of takes away from what OCD actually is, right? Or I'm a little ADD today. Things to think about, maybe a better example of this is like homosexuality was labeled as a mental illness until 1973, right? Today we know that like that's not true. Some people think there's no such thing as mental illness. That when we talk about illness, we mean like physical illness, as though your brain, the residence of mental illness, is not also part of your body. Mental health professionals obviously reject the idea that mental illness is fiction, but it is important for us to think about how we treat people, right? A better way, or a way that you might be able to relate to the concept of labeling theory is, have you ever heard something about someone, like a good friend or your friend's boss, right? And you haven't met them, and you've heard a certain amount of stuff about them. And then you meet them and you very quickly interpret that behavior and what you already know about them, the labels you already have for them, right? So like labels can be very powerful. We've also really started to treat deviance in terms of like medical conditions, right? So until the mid 20th century, we just viewed alcoholics as morally weak. Today we know that alcoholism, and I wouldn't even call this this is kind of a poor example on behalf of your textbook, because addiction is a physical illness, right? But when we think about deviance with a medical model, and by the way, we also sometimes think of crime as a medical model, right? It affects who responds to it, how we respond to it, and how competent we see the deviant person, right? So sometimes once we see someone as sick, we think of them as not responsible for their behavior. We see this with a lot of criminal behavior, where people are reluctant to say, XYZ might have played a role in this, because people fear that it means it dismisses their responsibility for it. My thoughts on this are like, your mental illness could play a role in your behavior. It doesn't mean you're not responsible for your behavior, right? It really kind of depends on the nature of the mental illness. Now, Sutherland proposes this theory called differential association theory, and basically says how much contact we have with people who encourage or discourage conventional behavior affects how deviant we are. This is a learning model. It makes a lot of sense. It was never published in like a journal. Sutherland published this in a textbook that he wrote. And he basically says criminal behavior is learned in interaction with others in intimate personal groups. Okay. So we don't inherit behavior. We don't invent it. Okay. It's in a process of communication with other people and in intimate groups, right? So basically, like, we're not going to hold a massive lecture hall on how to embezzle money, right? We don't hold a massive lecture hall on like how to, put cocaine into lines and snort it up your nose. How do you learn about how to do drugs? In small groups where like one of your ding dong friends shows you how to do it. Okay, what do we learn? We learn techniques for committing the crime, as well as like why we would want to do it. So like your friend is not only going to teach you how to smoke pot, right? But they're probably going to tell you why you'd want to smoke pot. Someone offers you pot, you're like, dude, drugs are bad. Remember when you're very little and you just have black and white thinking and you're like, oh, drugs are bad. I'll never do drugs. Or like, smoking is gross. I'll never do that. And a lot of people are vaping, which is way worse for you than smoking. Okay. How did you cross the line into that? Right? Somebody told you it'd be fun. It would feel good. You'd have a good time. And by the way, some of those things are fun and you do have a good time, right? Like there's a reason people do them. Now, the other thing you're going to learn when you learn about these motives or reasons to do something, the direction, whether those fall into like follow the law or break the law, is going to depend on, have you been given definitions of the law as a good thing or definitions of the law as a bad thing? Now, we're in America. We have mixed definitions about this, right? I'm a criminologist, so I mostly see the law as a good thing, but I'm also super critical of it. Sometimes the law is absolute garbage. Our system doesn't work very well, but I still have respect for the law. Not all the laws, but most of the laws. So how do we become delinquent? When our definitions of the law when we have more definitions of the law that are negative. Okay, that's that actual principle of differential association. Now, those differential associations vary in frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. Behavior learned early in life, right? That's harder behavior to break. If you have a bad habit that you've had since you were little, maybe it's like biting your nails or, I don't know, whatever it is, right? Those habits, long-term habits, are much harder to break, right? Intensity. What's the prestige of the source of that pattern, right? Like, who did you learn this behavior from? Is it someone you really look up to and admire? Now, how do we learn criminal behavior? Same damn way we learn anything else. Exact same way, okay? And finally, criminal behavior is an expression of needs and values, but that does not explain that, right? So I steal something because I want something, but wanting something doesn't explain stealing. There's lots of things I want. I don't necessarily do something about getting them or having them. It sort of sounds like I do steal, but I don't. Okay. Hershey has this theory called control theory or social control theory. Hershey's theory is not a theory of deviance. Hershey's like, listen, there's plenty of reason to break the rules. We don't need to explain that. That happens for everybody. Okay. He tries to explain conformity. Why do we break the rules? And basically, people who have little to lose are more likely to break the rules. And so he talks about how if we're strongly bonded to society, then we're less likely to break the rules. And if that bond is weak, we're more likely to break the rules. Now, what makes up that bond? One is our attachment. Our attachments to other people. And if you think about it, I'm sure if I ask you guys, you'll tell me you don't punch people because you don't want to go to jail. And that's true, but that's probably not the top reason you don't punch people. Okay? There's probably other reasons you don't punch people. And one of them is probably that there's certain people whose opinions you care about. Okay, you guys are probably not familiar with this TV show called The Real World, but it came on in the early mid-90s. It's like early reality TV. They take 7 strangers, they put them in a cool house somewhere, and they film them for a while. It's always people with wildly different personalities. They kind of clash, right? Think about any reality TV show you've watched, right? And especially any of the dating ones, right? I can remember watching The Real World and thinking, I could never do that. Because if my Nana saw me at my worst, I'd be so embarrassed. My Nana saw me running my mouth and cussing like a sailor. Oof, I'd be so embarrassed. I don't want my Nana to see that side of me. And if it was on TV, people would see it, right? You might care about like what a future employer thinks of you, what your coach thinks of you, things like that. Commitment and involvement kind of go together, right? So these are like, how much time are you spending in pro-social activities and what kind of things are you involved in? So I would bet that some of you guys are busy people, right? I know that if you're a criminal justice major, you're probably a busy person because most CJ majors are. A lot of them are working, they're playing sports, and they're going to school. You got too much to lose. You jeopardize all those things, and you're too damn busy for shenanigans. And the final one is beliefs, right? That's the part of you that's like, yeah, the reason I don't punch people is because like it's not cool to punch people. So what are some criticisms of this approach? It's a very relative view of deviance, right? So it sort of assumes that it's really not taking into account things that pretty much all of us across the board are like, yeah, that's a no, right? Like murder, sexual assault. For the most part, all of society's like hard no on that, right? That's not only defined as deviant because someone defines it as deviant, okay? It's also super hard to research, like, hey, did you get labeled and what role did that play? I think it makes sense instinctually, but it's hard to like actually support with any evidence. All right, our third paradigm, social conflict. So what about deviance and inequality? Who or what is deviant depends on who has the power, right? So who writes the laws? Who decides certain things are illegal? Who decides what the punishment will be? It's a story in the news the other day. One of the summer kids just sent it to me today. Let me see if I can find it real quick on my phone, because we had talked about stories like this. Let me find her text. Okay, so Crystal Kaiser was sentenced to 11 years in prison for killing her alleged sex trafficker. So she's 23 now, and she shot and killed Randall Volar, a man accused of sexually trafficking her. And she just got sentenced to prison. Okay, so the shooting took place in 2018 when she was 17. She shot him in the head, burned his house down, and stole his BMW. And while this is not great problem solving, right, I think it's important to think about, do we want to send someone to prison for a long time when a man was trafficking her as a child and sexually assaulting her, and she shot him to get away? I'm not sure I want that girl to go. Actually, I'm sure I don't want her to go to prison. Okay. Now, I'm going to tell you this. If you Google her, you'll see she's a young African-American woman. Okay. And if she had been an upper-class white girl who was trafficked, would she have gotten a lesser sentence? She certainly would have been able to afford a good attorney, and that might have played a role in that. So Liazos talks about our everyday conceptions of deviance, and Liazos refers to this as like nuts, sluts, and perverts. And what did they share? They share the trait of powerlessness, right? So if you don't have power and someone labels you as deviant, it's hard for you to reject or get that label to not stick to you. So basically, social conflict theory explains this in three ways. One, norms and laws reflect the interests of the rich and powerful. They have resources to resist deviant labels. How does O.J. Simpson kill his former wife and her friend and get acquitted of it, right? Because he can afford good attorneys and he's rich and he's powerful. And third, the widespread belief that norms and laws are natural, that the belief that those are natural masks the fact that they're actually politically motivated. Okay, so I don't think we've talked about Marxism too much. I think we're going to get to it in our next chapter. But Spitzer, who's in the Marxist tradition, says deviant labels are applied to those who interfere with the operation of capitalism. Okay, so capitalism basically is the private control of property, and people who threaten that risk being labeled deviant. Basically, like if you threaten Jeff Bezos' ability to make billions of dollars by, paying people poorly and jacking up the price of toilet paper during COVID, you risk being labeled deviant. Capitalism depends on productive labor. Capitalism depends on respect for authority. And those who directly challenge the capitalist status quo are more likely to be labeled as deviant. So it's interesting, right? We condemn and we're like, you can go to prison for a long time for illegal drugs, right? But we also live in a country where every 5 seconds on TV, okay, that's an exaggeration, but frequently on TV, you're going to see ads for drugs that will solve your every problem. And yes, some of them are serious problems. I don't know about you guys, but I've been sneezing like crazy with allergies, right? I'm taking medicine for that and I'm still sneezing like crazy. That's a real genuine problem, okay? But man, they'll sell you a drug for anything. Like, you're 80 years old and you can't maintain an erection, which is normal for being 80. We got a pill for that, right? And we're constantly telling you how a pill can solve your problem. And I'm not saying don't take medication if you have a problem. I'm just saying it's sort of odd that we're like, pills make things better, but then we're like, but hey, don't take these other pills, right? We think it's just like something to be like, haha, that's your habit if you drink like 4 or 5 cups of coffee a day. Caffeine is super addictive, right? Alcohol, terribly addictive, terrible for you, actually leads to violence. And you can do that publicly at Applebee's. Okay? White collar crime, right? We don't hear a lot about white collar crime. Our next slide's going to talk about corporate crime, right? Because these are committed by people of high social class, right? So the punishment for them is not as severe. It's crime in the suites as opposed to crime in the streets. A lot of it is regulated by civil law. And basically what happens is in a civil case, like if you lose, you have to pay fines and fees, but we don't label you as a criminal. Only 55% of people who embezzled money were convicted in criminal courts, served a prison sentence. But if you guys steal from the store down the street from you, you probably get a prison sentence. Corporate crimes are a type of white collar crime, but it's committed on behalf of the corporation or people acting on its behalf. So sometimes companies will find out, right, they've manufactured something that's dangerous, and they'll do the calculation of what it costs to recall that product and pay people back for that product versus what they might have to pay out in lawsuits. And if it's significantly less than lawsuits, they might choose to leave the product on the market. Most of these crimes, this is everything from like dumping toxic waste somewhere, all kinds of crimes. Most of these go unpunished. Now, organized crime, we consider this street crime. These are businesses that supply illegal goods or services. This is a protection racket. So again, if you've seen any mob movie, you know, if the neighborhood thug provides protection for your, you know, local business, you pay him a fee. Sex work, drugs, gambling, credit card fraud, fake IDs, you know, so much stuff. Organized crime, again, you could take an entire class on this. It's sold to a willing public, and prohibition played an enormous role in this. So when we made alcohol illegal, it's not like people were like, okay, I guess I won't drink anymore. We created a whole market for the illegal manufacture and selling of alcohol. And then when alcohol became legal again, they just use that network for other things. Okay, so what are some criticisms of this approach? It implies that laws are created directly by the rich and powerful. And that's not really how it works. Some of them run for office, but mostly they just funnel money to people who run for office. And the law does also protect workers in the environment, right? So I'm sure most of you guys had jobs as teenagers, and there were laws that protected you. You might have thought they were stupid at the time, right? So like in Massachusetts, I don't know if these are exactly the same because it's been a long time since I was a teenager. But I know we could not work past like 7 p.m. if you were under 16, I think. And you couldn't work more than like 4 hours at a time if you were under 16, right? There's laws around like you got to be 18 to like, you know, use the meat slicer at the deli counter, things like that. If you guys work a job in Massachusetts where you get paid time and a half on a Sunday, that's because of the law. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about hate crimes. Hate crimes are regular crimes, but a crime that you can show has been motivated by racial or other type of bias. Okay, so that can be race, religion, ancestry, sexual orientation, physical disability. Okay, what happens under the law is if you can prove it's a hate crime, you get a sentencing enhancement for that. So you'd get the punishment you get for like assault, but then if you could prove it was motivated by racial bias, you'd get extra time for that. Okay. Now, the category that has the most hate crimes is race. But just to give you an idea, 1 in 5 lesbians and gay men have been physically assaulted. 90% have been verbally assaulted because of their sexual orientation. Okay, 43 states have legislation that raises the penalty when a crime is motivated by hate. The problem is this is actually really hard to prove in court, right? So knowing it, like, oh, clearly that person did that because of X, Y, Z, and being able to prove it are two different things. Now, some people feel like if the enhancement is just because you hated this group of people, are you punishing speech? Are you punishing politically incorrect thoughts? But other people feel like when a hate crime is committed, it's also sending a message to everybody that's a member of that group, right? And it kind of scares the hell out of them. Now we have more stringent normative controls for women than for men. Like we play a lot, we're a lot more restrictive with women. We're really living through a period here today where they're trying to pass a lot more laws that are about controlling women and controlling women's bodies. And gender plays a role in theories too. So as I told you guys a bunch of times, most theories have been invented by men, white men, okay? And most research has been done on them. So as I mentioned before, string theory. Are women's goals material success? Yeah, for some women, they also want a house and 2 cars. Yeah, for sure, right? But maybe women's strain comes from somewhere else. We use different standards for labeling women, right? So men's sexual behavior, we're often like, boys will be boys. That's locker room talk, right? And it's given a pass. But if women sleep with, quote unquote, too many people, right, we judge them for that. All right, so let's talk about crime a little bit. All crimes have several elements, but all have 2. One is an act. There needs to be a voluntary act, right? So like if I do something while I'm sleepwalking and I can prove that I have a history of that, right, of getting up and doing stuff in my sleep, then I might not be criminally responsible for that. If you push me and I bump into someone else and that person falls into the street and gets hurt, have I assaulted that person? No. You have, but I have not. Right? It also generally involves intent. Now, there's a series of laws that are called strict liability laws. You don't have to prove intent. Like, we don't have to prove intent with speeding. If you're speeding, you're speeding. Statutory rape is a strict liability law as well. I don't have to prove you intended to have sexual contact with someone without their consent. People under a certain age are presumed to be unable to consent. Okay, we have crimes against people, crimes against property, and then we have crimes we consider quote unquote victimless. Those are things where it's hard to identify who the victim is, right? Or we don't have a traditional victim. So like if I sell you drugs, I'm willingly selling you drugs and you're willingly buying those drugs. Who's the victim? Yeah, people are victimized, but who's the victim? Okay. We have several different ways of collecting criminal statistics. It's important to understand these because you'll see them like in the news and in the media all the time, and they're often misleading. But we don't have time to go into this in depth. Talk about this a lot in criminal justice. If you're a CJ major, you'll learn a lot more about this. We have official crime statistics that are based on police reports. It used to be a method called the UCR, the Uniform Crime Report. We switched over to NIBRS, which is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. One thing to know about official statistics is because they come from police, it's only going to include crimes reported to the police. And there's a lot of things nobody reports to the police. Well, one way we can find out about those crimes is through victimization surveys. We can survey people and ask them questions about if they've been victimized. We can also survey people and ask them about behavior they've engaged in. So some general characteristics when it comes to street crime, right? So street crime is a young person's game. People start offending in their teens and they age out generally by their mid-20s. Okay, so those between 18 and 24 are 14% of the population. I think they're a little bit lower right now, but like 40% of the crime. So young people are disproportionately responsible for crime. Gender, men are responsible for 75% of crime overall. 83% of violent crimes. Socioeconomic status, poor people, arrest data would tell us that crime is widespread amongst poor people, but it's more complicated than it appears. Remember, the crimes that rich people commit are less likely to come to the attention of the police. Okay. So race and ethnicity, about 64% of arrests for index crimes are committed by white people, and white people are about 64% of the population. So in raw numbers, more white people get arrested, but black people are arrested at a disproportionate rate. Okay. What does that mean? They're arrested at a rate that's higher than their existence in the population. What might be reasons for this? Well, race and socioeconomic status are closely related. There is some research that indicates there are more high rate offenders amongst Black folks. High rate offenders meaning people who offend repeatedly. Um, One thing to think about too, though, is that like official crime rates exclude, many crimes that are typically committed more often by white folks. Thing to keep in mind, all those statistics or characteristics, demographics is the word I'm looking for, right? Young, poor, Black, and male that are likely to commit crime are also our most likely victims. Young, poor, Black, and male. So Blacks are 6 times more likely to die homicide than whites. Here you can see our crime rates over time, right? So when people are telling you like crime is going up, crime's been going down. It's been going down for a long time, right? Peaks in the early to mid 90s. Okay. Rates of violent and property crime much higher here in the US than in Europe. What does this come from? Part of it is our culture for sure, right? We have a lot of focus on economic success here. So a lot of diversity here, a lot of inequality here, and weak social fabric. The other big issue here is guns, okay? 2/3 of murder victims in the US die from guns, okay? If I shoot you as opposed to stab you, if I stab you, you have a much better shot of surviving that, right? Almost half of U.S. households own a gun. There's more guns than adults in the U.S. In California, the number of people killed by knives is greater than all the people killed in Canada by all weapons. Go America. All right, here's a really brief overview of the criminal justice system. Again, you can get a bachelor's degree in this, a master's degree in this, a PhD in this. Okay, so the criminal justice system has to follow the rules. Okay, if I want to arrest you, convict you, and send you to prison, I have to follow the rules to do so. That's called due process of law. Okay, that's in the Bill of Rights, and it means anyone charged with a crime has to be given fair notice of legal proceedings, the ability to present a defense, and a judge or jury that weighs your evidence impartially. Okay, I can't just decide I'm the president of the United States and I don't like you, so I'm going to send you to prison. Kings and queens can do that. Dictators can do that. But, can't do that here in America. Most people's first contact or any contact with the criminal justice system is contact with the police. Okay? The police have to have probable cause before they can arrest you. Probable cause is the belief that a crime was committed and it's likely that you committed it. Okay? Police work is inherently dangerous. A lot of police work is boring time spent on your butt in a car, but the possibility of being killed at work is there every single day. Officers have to be responsible for each other and each other's safety, and we've seen an increased emphasis recently on de-escalation. How can we de-escalate a situation? How you respond to a person who's having a hard time, you can make that situation worse or you can make it better. Okay. And a lot of that has to do with the language you use, how you stand when you talk to someone, how close you are to them. And you can escalate or de-escalate that situation. Police have an enormous amount of discretion. They don't arrest everybody. They could never arrest everybody. The system can barely handle the people we do arrest. So what do they base discretion on? How serious is the offense? If I catch you standing over a dead body with a knife in your hand, I really can't let you go. I don't have a lot of discretion there, right? It's a pretty serious offense. If I catch you and you're 18 and you're in the woods drinking with your buddies, I have some discretion there. I can maybe take your beer, pour it all out, and send you all home. What does the victim want? Okay, so if you stole something from me, I have had 2 laptops stolen from me. Okay, in both cases, I chose not to press charges, mostly because I just wanted the laptop back. I didn't really care what happened to the people who took it. And I told the police I didn't want to press charges and just wanted it back. By the way, I've gotten it back both times. The person's demeanor. If you act like an asshole when the police come upon you, so you're drinking in the woods with your friends and you act a fool and you act disrespectful, you're probably getting arrested. If you're polite and deferential, probably not going to get arrested. Do you have a previous record? Is this my 7th Friday in a row catching you in the woods? Are there bystanders, right? If you act a fool in front of a bunch of people, well, it's a lot more pressure for me to arrest you. And while this is not part of discretion, people of color are more likely to be arrested. Okay, you get arrested, you get charged with a crime, we're going to take you to court. Our system here in the United States is an adversarial process. We pit two people against each other, a prosecutor and a defense attorney, and their goal is to fight it out, and supposedly we will get the truth that way. It doesn't really lead to the truth, but most cases, most convictions come from plea bargaining, upwards of 90%. That's a negotiation where the prosecutor and the defense work together. You agree to plead generally to a lesser charge and you get lesser time, and the system saves from having to take you to court. Okay, so we've taken you to court or you've pled guilty and now you're going to be punished. There's 4 philosophies for punishment. There's a 5th philosophy, but it's a little more complex and we won't talk about it. One is retribution, right? This is legal vengeance, okay? It's the idea that you need to be punished for what you did. Deterrence is the idea that fear of punishment will prevent people from breaking the law. This can be general. The fact that you know a punishment exists and you don't want that punishment and therefore you don't break the law is general deterrence. Specific deterrence is you broke the law, you got punished, you didn't like that, you won't do it again. Rehabilitation is reforming the offender. And incapacitation is literally doing something to you, usually putting you in prison, so that you are incapable of harming other people. But the death penalty is the ultimate incapacitation. In countries where they cut off your hand if you steal, that's incapacitation as well. Now, we're terrible at punishment in the United States. Well, we're good. We punish people. But we have a high rate of recidivism. So many people go back to prison. Speaking of the death penalty, right? The argument here is that the death penalty deters crime. The other argument for the death penalty is retribution. Research tells us it does not deter crime. We are on the decline in using it here in the U.S. Maybe you're in my death penalty class this semester. It's often applied unjustly. So again, here's one slide on a topic you could spend the entire semester on. Sometimes when you get punished, you get sent to a community-based corrections program. That's basically punishment that exists within the community. If you guys have ever driven by a van on the side of the road, it usually says community corrections. It might say sheriff's department on it. There's a bunch of people out there in a uniform picking up trash. That's community-based corrections. Okay? Lower cost, reduces overcrowding, and it allows us to supervise people while eliminating the problems that come along with prison. People are allowed to remain home, remain in their jobs, support their families. You could be sentenced to probation. Probation is a suspended sentence. You're allowed to remain in the community and you have conditions imposed upon you in the court. That could include something like house arrest or an ankle bracelet, GPS monitor. It could include things like anger management, going to AA, stuff like that. Parole is similar to probation, but it happens you get released from prison early. It suspends part of your sentence, and then you're supervised after you've been released. For both probation and parole, if you break it, you can end up in prison. Shock probation is where the judge sends you to prison for a short time. Basically come check out prison, see if this is really where you want to be, and then you go on probation afterwards. Now to wrap this up, a thing to think about with punishment is the suffering goes beyond just having to be in prison, okay? Some prisons, in Massachusetts prison is relatively safe, but some prisons are super dangerous and it has long-term impacts on people. Once people have been incarcerated, it becomes significantly harder to get gainful employment, which ups the odds that you'll recidivate, creates a lot of problems for people.